After that morning, nothing returned the same. The women who passed through that hall never spoke of it again. Whatever unfolded there, it left a mark no record could erase. Some orders leave no trace, but they leave everything behind. A folder slid across the desk, not choice, only instruction. Her name circled in red ink, a reassignment already noted in another ledger. Others had gone before her, signatures faint but present. Hours remained on the clock. One glance at the papers said refusal was irrelevant. A stamp pressed a silent consequence, yet the details were intentionally left blank. By the time she reached the door, it was already processed, like she was too late to object. She stepped into a corridor that felt both familiar and alien. The walls, once white, were now a dull, washed-out gray. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows that danced like specters along the floor. Her shoes echoed softly against the tiles, but the sound felt swallowed by the hall itself. There were doors on either side, each slightly ajar, yet none seemed to lead anywhere significant. She realized she didn't know where she belonged. The silence pressed on her chest, heavier than any noise could have been, as if the building itself was waiting for her to make a misstep. The corridor didn't belong to anyone, and yet it expected obedience. A line of tape ran across the floor near the far end. She noticed it but didn't know its purpose. Standing beyond it felt wrong, standing before it felt uncertain. There were no instructions posted, no posted signs, yet everyone seemed to navigate around the invisible rules without hesitation. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, a mix that unsettled more than comforted. Each step forward was measured, cautious, as if the walls themselves judged her movements. She became acutely aware of the slightest noise. The hum of ventilation, the tap of distant heels, the rustle of a folder. Every sound, every step, hinted at a structure she could never fully understand. She sensed rules existed, yet no one would ever tell her what they were or why they mattered. Faces turned subtly away when she looked. Eyes darted, heads lowered, gestures minimized. No one met her gaze. Not one person acknowledged her presence beyond the barest requirement. Conversations were muted and transactional, punctuated by long pauses where even breathing seemed deliberate. She noticed the way shoulders stiffened when someone passed behind her, how papers were shuffled with exaggerated care. Every glance avoided became a question unanswered. She began to realize that silence was an active force here, not just the absence of speech. Every moment of inattention felt deliberate, and she felt both invisible and scrutinized at once. Time stretched unevenly. Clocks ticked in fits, one hand moving faster than the other, then pausing in a way that drew attention to their own rhythm. Footsteps were few, measured, almost ritualistic. Her breathing sounded impossibly loud, as if the walls absorbed everything else. A single door opened and closed somewhere far away, yet the sound vibrated through the hallway with disproportionate intensity. Shadows shifted as if anticipating movement that never came. She realized she was listening not for events, but for permission, for a sign that anything could happen, yet nothing would. Even sound was oppressive, as if silence had a weight heavier than any act could create. She tried to memorize the order of the desks, the placement of chairs, the direction of footsteps. One glance toward a colleague drew a subtle shift, a hand brushing a folder, a chair slightly repositioned. The tiniest acknowledgement of her attention felt like an evaluation. Questions, even unspoken ones, seemed to ripple through the room and return as judgment. She sensed that any attempt to understand, to anticipate, or to prepare would itself be observed and catalogued. The hall, the people, the routine, all felt alive with quiet surveillance. Curiosity itself had a cost, though she could not yet name what it was. The morning began like any other, yet the subtle rhythm of the hall had already shifted. A chair scraped against the floor in the wrong cadence, not matching the usual thrum of movement. The lights flickered, just long enough to make shadows stretch unnaturally across the walls, elongating door frames that normally felt comforting. One of the old clocks ticked, then skipped, leaving a suspended moment where she realized even time might have betrayed her. She followed the usual path toward the filing room, only to find the door locked, not jammed, not new, but locked as if her presence was no longer expected there. The familiar had already begun to betray her. The distant tapping of heels, once steady, fell silent. A hum that should have comforted instead vibrated with absence. Each heartbeat felt louder, sharper, magnifying the lack. She noticed it first in the way others froze mid-step, eyes darting to empty corners. Something as small as a missing sound had already shifted the mood, and it was impossible to ignore. The coffee cart never arrived. In past mornings, it had rolled quietly through the hall, signaling normalcy, giving a rhythm to the chaos. That day, it didn't. No explanation was offered. No one mentioned it. The absence of such a mundane occurrence loomed larger than any confrontation. She glanced at the others, expecting questions, shared confusion, something human. But everyone continued their tasks as though the anomaly hadn't happened, pretending it was ordinary, rehearsed, inevitable. Her unease multiplied. She realized the system's indifference was not casual, it was procedural. Some things disappear so quietly, you begin to doubt your own memory. Hours merged without boundaries. She looked at the clock, then away, then back again. The hands had moved, but she couldn't tell how long. Morning stretched into noon, noon dissolved into afternoon, yet nothing felt sequential. Events overlapped like ghosts of themselves. Shifts blurred together, leaving only impressions of movement and silence. Footsteps echoed in patterns that did not belong to anyone. Doors opened and closed, sometimes twice, sometimes not at all. She passed the same hallway 3 times without noticing it at first. Paper stacks were slightly shifted each time. She couldn't tell if she had moved or if the building itself had subtly shifted, aligning itself to some invisible rule she would never understand. Ledger books lay open in the filing room. Names were crossed, underlined, sometimes repeated twice, sometimes missing entirely. She tried to follow the trail, attempting to track events, but the patterns refused logic. Entries contradicted one another. One document suggested a presence, another erased it. Even paper felt complicit in erasure. Certain colleagues didn't appear where they should have. Others showed up in places they weren't supposed to be. She realized absence was no longer a lack, it was a message. Missing faces spoke louder than any conversation. She recorded it mentally, though she knew that noticing might itself be dangerous. It wasn't what was present that frightened her. It was what vanished without a trace. A colleague paused mid-step, eyes flicking toward an empty desk. The pause lasted just a fraction of a second, but it carried weight. Names that should have been spoken went unmentioned. Files that should have existed were gone. She noticed one missing ledger entirely, its absence confirming a reality she couldn't yet articulate. The line on the floor she had memorized shifted slightly overnight. She knew because her foot grazed it differently, barely. She realized that even the smallest adjustment signaled boundaries she didn't fully comprehend, and any misstep might be recorded silently. A glance toward a supervisor revealed no shock, no inquiry, only practiced indifference. But the way they stepped back, subtly altering posture, whispered that something unthinkable had already occurred, something she was now a part of, whether she knew it or not. The line had moved, and she had already stepped across it without permission. Weeks had passed. The hall felt familiar yet hollow. Footsteps echoed differently now, slower, as if the building itself had learned to move around a missing presence. Paperwork arrived on desks in neat stacks, yet the sequence of events recorded no longer aligned with her memory. One file, previously at the top of the pile, had vanished entirely, a ledger entry erased, replaced by an empty sheet. She remembered signing it, had watched the names listed, yet the evidence was gone. It wasn't just forgotten, it was removed. The air smelled faintly of old ink and disinfectant. It was a scent that once promised order, now a reminder of its absence. She observed a colleague tracing fingers across folders, hesitating as if sensing the missing traces. Their hesitation wasn't curiosity, it was recognition. Recognition that some things were not meant to be questioned. The disappearance wasn't accidental, it was intentional. Files contradicted her recollection. Shifts that she had worked, hours she had observed, names she had interacted with, none matched the official records. Some names appeared twice, others were erased. Forms were signed in ink she didn't recognize. Dates shifted subtly, procedures altered just enough to make the past unrecognizable. The record was rewriting itself, but the rewriting was invisible. A new set of instructions arrived. Standard, administrative, unemotional. She followed them mechanically. The act of compliance felt hollow, almost ritualistic. The ledger's absence hung over her. Any attempt to reconcile memory with the record was a silent act of rebellion, punished not by authority but by omission. Erasure itself had become a form of control. Weeks merged into months. Colleagues avoided certain topics not out of fear but habit. Certain shifts went unmentioned, certain names passed without acknowledgement. The erasure was internalized, normalized. Each survivor moved carefully, avoiding the traces of what had vanished. It wasn't the orders that lingered, it was the absence. She noticed that every routine now contained gaps. Chairs left in odd places, folders shuffled differently, even lighting subtly adjusted. These small cues were survival markers, signals that the erased event still existed, just out of reach. The system did not punish openly. It erased quietly, leaving only human awareness as the memory. One missing document became a symbol. The ledger she had relied on, meticulously maintained, was gone, replaced by a blank sheet stamped with an administrative seal, a quiet declaration that this never happened. Others worked around it as though it were normal. No one spoke. No one looked back. Absence became louder than presence. Procedures shifted subtly. Tasks she had known by rote now required steps that seemed logical, but were unspoken, unseen. Each adjustment reinforced the sense that reality itself was under revision. She felt trapped in an invisible machinery where compliance was meaningless unless memory itself was surrendered. She realized that the consequences were not punitive. They were systemic and absolute. Gradually, the pattern became undeniable. Certain events, certain shifts, certain people had been systematically erased. Not through accident, not through oversight, but by design. Even if someone remembered, the record would not confirm it. Even observation could not validate what had happened. What existed in memory could not exist in reality. She began to catalog absences, folders, names, procedures, even gestures. Each missing element compounded the unease. By acknowledging what was gone, she risked noticing the machinery behind the erasure. By ignoring it, she became part of it. Awareness itself carried the weight of the system's quiet power. The smell of ink, the feel of paper, the flicker of light, all now served as reminders that presence could be illusion. Every touch, every sound, every recorded moment seemed subject to revision. A chair left slightly askew, a paper missing its corner, a name miswritten, all subtle signals of what had already been removed. Even reality could not be trusted, only observation remained. She began noticing the micro-decisions of others, hesitations, glances, subtle shifts. These behaviors were the only confirmations that anything had truly happened. The absence of documents combined with human awareness created a tension she could neither resolve nor articulate. The system erased the past, but the living carried it in silence. The hall was quiet, not just silent but suspended as if holding its breath. Desks were aligned, papers stacked, light flickering softly through the windows. Nothing moved. Yet the absence of movement carried weight. Chairs that had been used for weeks now sat empty, untouched. Small details, a pen on its side, a ledger slightly open, a forgotten envelope, all suggested the echoes of activity long gone. She walked the length of the corridor. Her footsteps made no sound. She remembered every absent face, every erased file, every shift that had been quietly removed from records. Even as she moved, the system continued, invisible, indifferent. No authority loomed, no reprimand, no acknowledgement. Only procedure, silently enforced. Some places continue as if nothing happened, yet everything has changed. She sat quietly, watching colleagues move through habitual motions. Each gesture precise, each pause intentional. Nothing overtly acknowledged the past, yet everything hinted at it. Glances lingered longer than necessary, documents were handled with care bordering on ritual, and words were chosen carefully to avoid history. The realization struck her. The system was not guilty nor benevolent, it was just efficient, cold. The human cost, the silences, the absences, all irrelevant to its purpose. She understood now that the machinery of erasure had no face. No one could be blamed, yet everyone bore witness. You cannot blame the system, but you cannot escape its consequences. She began walking again, tracing the edges of the hall, comparing what she remembered with what was written. Names missing, shifts erased, movements unrecorded, yet alive in her memory. Every moment she remembered became a quiet act of resistance. Every recognition of absence was a rebellion without words. She noticed small cues. A chair misaligned, a pen rotated differently than she left it. A ledger open to a blank page, subtle signals that presence existed only in awareness. Others did not notice, or they chose not to. Silence became a shield, observation a weapon. Memory is the only record that survives when all else is erased. She paused in the center of the hall, letting her mind trace the sequence of what had been ordered, what had been erased, what had been silently endured. She felt the weight of obedience, the subtle terror of routine, and the quiet horror of complicity. None of it had been recorded, none of it officially acknowledged, and yet it all mattered in ways the system would never know. A question hovered. In a world where orders erase themselves, where compliance and survival intertwine, where does morality reside? She could not answer. The system offered no guidance, only continuation. And the hall, patient, waited silently for the next cycle. Obedience leaves traces in the mind, even when it leaves none on paper. She leaned against a desk, closed her eyes, and listened. The absence of noise was louder than any conversation. A fan whirred faintly in the distance. Footsteps echoed somewhere, but they did not belong to her. The weight of unsaid things pressed against her, heavy, subtle, unavoidable. The moral question remained unresolved. When silence becomes habitual, when erasure is standard, when compliance is automatic, who is accountable? She understood the answer could not come from outside. It had to be carried within, a quiet burden each person bore alone. The system does not punish, it teaches in silence. She walked to the window and looked outside. Light shifted across the hall. Shadows of chairs stretched across the floor longer than they should have been. Nothing stirred. Nothing had changed. Yet inside everything had shifted. Memories of absence, gestures erased, and silent compliance pressed upon her mind. A pause, unmeasured, silent, lingering, and then the camera or the viewer's attention lingers too, suspended in the same quiet. Nothing is resolved, yet the story has left its mark. When the system moves on and nothing is recorded, what survives of human choice? Some lessons are not written, they are lived and remembered alone.